Hi, students and teachers. We are back. I hope everyone had a great spring break and have settled back into the routine of school and learning. For me, this is a big week. It is a big week for our religion class. We will be discussing the Easter message. Now, I know we've already celebrated Easter in our homes and in our churches, but now we're going to talk about it here in religion class. It's what we've been building up to since the start of the school year. God created us. We sinned. Our consequence was separation from God, and now we're at the point in which God's rescue plan is made complete. When we last met, Jesus had ministered for 3 years among the people, teaching, healing, performing miracles. And as he and his disciples were in Jerusalem celebrating the Passover, the religious leaders put a plan in place that led to his arrest and his crucifixion. I'd like to start today by doing a big rewind and looking at how the big story of the Bible has played out up to this point. This should help us remember some of the main things that have happened so far in God's story. Check this out.
In the beginning, God created the universe and a planet called Earth. Humans were formed in God's image to continue God's work. But soon, humans decided we want to live our way, not God's. Selfishness and violence filled the world, so God started over with just one family. And God made a covenant with a man named Abraham. The land around you is now yours. Your family will be my blessing to the entire world. In just a few generations, they grew into a large nation named Israel. The Egyptians became fearful and forced the Israelites to be their slaves. Through a humble leader named Moses, God led the Israelites in a great exodus back toward their promised land. Along the journey, God gave laws and commands to help the Israelites follow God's ways. Finally, after 40 years of struggle and complaining in the desert, the Israelites arrived back home in the promised land. In victory, the people worshipped God, but soon after, they turned from God and lived their own rebellious ways. This became a pattern from generation to generation. Now living back in their promised land, Israel continually struggled to follow God's ways. So Saul became Israel's first king. But he led the country poorly and turned his back on God. So God chose a courageous young man named David to be king. God blessed Israel greatly under David's leadership. David passed on his throne to his son, Solomon, who was full of God's wisdom. Solomon built a magnificent temple, but as the years passed, Solomon strayed from God, and the country was torn apart in civil war. So God sent prophets as messengers to challenge the Israelites to return to God's better ways. But they wouldn't listen. God's people were forced out of the promised land, the temple was destroyed, and many were taken away as slaves. But God was still watching over them, speaking words of hope through the prophets. 60 years later, this hope was realized when the Jewish people were freed to return to their promised land. God's prophets pointed to the future and a coming king, one who would fully restore Israel and bring a new kingdom of peace. So the Jewish people waited and hoped, and God would not speak through the prophets again for 400 years. 400 years passed since God spoke through the prophets. They were now ruled by the Roman Empire, and the Jewish people longed for a Messiah to come and liberate them. Then, Mary, a young woman still a virgin, gave birth to a boy named Jesus, meaning one who saves. Angels announced that he was the Messiah King. Overjoyed, a group of shepherds ran to tell everyone in sight this birth was truly a miracle. When Jesus grew up, he faced the same temptations as all people, but always chose to follow God's ways. Jesus showed his closest followers, called disciples, how to live in the ways of God. He told them, "The kingdom of God has come. Now turn from your ways to God's ways." Using profound stories called parables, Jesus challenged the Jewish people to search for the deep realities of God's kingdom. As crowds surrounded Jesus everywhere, he felt compassion for them, giving them food, healing their illnesses, and even raising people from the dead. Jesus was a different kind of king than expected. He wasn't a military leader. Instead, he led through compassion, justice, and loving those who were forgotten. The religious leaders were jealous of Jesus' huge following and shocked by his claims to be God's son. He must be stopped, they thought. One night, while Jesus was praying, they sent an armed mob to drag him away. Horrified, his disciples ran away and hid. The religious leaders questioned Jesus. "Are you the Messiah, the Son of God?" Jesus answered, "I am, and you will see me seated next to God in power." Enraged, the leaders shouted, "Any man who claims to be God must be executed." Pressured by the religious leaders and an angry crowd, the Roman governor sentenced Jesus to death. Like a criminal, Jesus was nailed to a wooden cross between two thieves. He cried out, "Father, please forgive them. They don't know what they're doing." Darkness filled the skies, and Jesus breathed his last breath.
Hopefully you recognized a few of those stops along the way in our journey. Adam and Eve, Noah, Abraham, Moses, the Promised Land, David, the prophets, Mary, and then finally Jesus. Now, when we discussed Jesus' death last week, there was likely a sense of sadness or disappointment within some of you, just like there was within his followers as it was happening. They had been right there with Jesus all along, and now he was gone. They probably thought it had been all for nothing. They were hopeless, and they didn't have any idea really what to do next. But all of that was about to change. I'm going to let the Jesus Storybook Bible take it from here. This has been a big part of our journey so far, and within each of its stories has been the hint or the promise of what was to come in Jesus. So let's look at what was happening when we last met, and then we'll let them lead us into the big events of Easter. I'm going to start with reading, and then we're going to switch to a video. This is right about the time when Jesus was hung on the cross. Even though it was midday, a dreadful darkness covered the face of the world. The sun could not shine. The earth trembled and quaked. The great mountains shook, rocks split in two, until it seemed that the whole world would break, that creation itself would tear apart. The full force of the storm of God's fierce anger at sin was coming down on his own Son, instead of his people. It was the only way God could destroy sin and not destroy his children whose hearts were filled with sin. Then Jesus shouted out in a loud voice, "It is finished!" And it was. He had done it. Jesus had rescued the whole world. "Father," Jesus cried, "I give you my life." And with a great sigh, he let himself die. Strange clouds and shadows filled the sky, purple, orange, black, like a bruise. Here's the next picture of the soldiers in the tomb. Jesus' friends gently carried Jesus. They laid Jesus in a new tomb carved out of rock. How could Jesus die? What had gone wrong? What did it mean? They didn't know anything anymore, except they did know their hearts were breaking. "That's the end of Jesus," the leaders said. But just to be sure, they sent strong soldiers to guard the tomb. They hauled a huge stone in front of the door to the tomb so that no one could get in or out. Now I'm going to let the video take it from here.
God's wonderful surprise. Jesus' friends were sad. They would never see their best friend again. How could this happen? Wasn't Jesus the rescuer, the king God had promised? It wasn't supposed to end like this. Yes, but whoever said anything about the end? Just before sunrise, on the third day, God sent an earthquake and an angel from heaven. When the guards saw the angel, they fell down with fright. The angel rolled the huge stone away, sat on top of it, and waited. At the first glimmer of dawn, Mary Magdalene and other women headed to the tomb to wash Jesus' body. The early morning sun slanted through the ancient olive trees, drops of dew glittering on leaves and grasses, little tears everywhere. The friends walked quietly along the hilly path through the olive groves until they reached the tomb, and immediately noticed something odd. It was wide open. They peered through the opening into the dark tomb. But wait, Jesus' body was gone. And something else. A shining man was there with clothes made from lightning. "Don't be scared," the angel said. But they couldn't help it. They screamed anyway. The angel asked them, "What are you doing here? This is a tomb, and tombs are for dead people." The women couldn't speak. "Jesus isn't dead anymore," he said. "He's alive again." And their hearts leapt, and then the angel laughed with such gladness that they felt for a moment as if they had woken from a nightmare. The other women rushed home, but Mary stayed behind. How could it be true? Jesus was definitely dead. How could he be alive? Just then, Mary heard someone else in the garden. Perhaps it's the gardener, she thought. He'll know where Jesus' body is. "I don't know where Jesus is," Mary said urgently. "I can't find him." But it was all right. Jesus knew where she was, and he had found her. Mary. Only one person said her name like that. She could hear her heart thumping. She turned around. She could just make out a figure. She shaded her eyes to see, and thought she was dreaming. But she wasn't dreaming. She was seeing Jesus. Mary fell to the ground. Sudden tears filled her eyes, and great sobs shook her whole body, and all she wanted in that moment was to cling to Jesus and never let him go. "You'll be able to hold on to me later, Mary," Jesus said gently, "and always be close to me. But now go and tell the others that I'm alive." Mary ran and ran all the way to the city. She had never run so fast or so far in all her life. She felt she could have run forever. She didn't even feel like her feet touched the ground. The sun seemed to be dancing and gleaming and bounding across the sky, racing with her and shining brighter than she could ever remember in the clear, fresh air. And it seemed to her that morning, as she ran, almost as if the whole world had been made anew, almost as if the whole world was singing for joy. The trees, tiny sounds in the grass, the birds. Her heart. Was God really making everything sad come untrue? Was he making even death come untrue? She couldn't wait to tell Jesus' friends. "They won't believe it," she laughed. She was right, of course.
Now, there's a lot we could say about all of this, but I'd like to start out by talking about the women. Our female teachers and students have had to put up with a lot of Bible stories in which women have either been left out entirely or just barely mentioned. But now, Jesus has given a place of honor and value to his female followers, as well as an enormous responsibility. Mary Magdalene and the other women are the first to hear of Jesus' resurrection. Mary is the first one to whom he appears in his resurrected body. And because of all this, the women are the first to tell the Easter message. I have this really cool chart in my study Bible I'd like to show you if I can. See that right there? So this shows that there were 11 different resurrection appearances of Jesus, and it charts which of the 4 Gospels those were in. In addition to what you saw in the video, Jesus also appeared to 2 men traveling on the road to Emmaus. He appeared to Peter in Jerusalem, to 10 of the disciples in the upper room, to 7 disciples fishing on the Sea of Galilee, to 11 disciples on a mountain, and more. The final appearance is 40 days after the resurrection, when he ascends into heaven and promises his followers that the Holy Spirit will soon follow him. Now, we're going to talk more about all that next week, but first, there is a very important interaction between Jesus and one of his disciples in this list of resurrection appearances that I'd like us to focus on. In the events leading up to Jesus' death, Peter had denied knowing him. And it didn't just happen once, it happened 3 times. Peter had sworn to Jesus that he would remain faithful to him no matter what. But fear or panic or whatever reasons led Peter to freeze up and to tell others that he had not been one of Jesus' followers. Now, way back in the early parts of the ministry of Jesus, Peter had been one who had boldly proclaimed Jesus to be the Christ, the Son of God. And when that happened, Jesus responded that on this rock he would build his church. Now, you see, the name Peter actually means rock. So Jesus is saying here that Peter will be the foundation of the Christian church. And Peter would have carried that information with him from that point on. So to have messed up so badly, Peter probably considered himself a failure. And how would Jesus ever be able to build his church on a failure? I suspect that once everything had settled down and Peter realized he had denied knowing Jesus, he was terribly ashamed of himself. So when the resurrected Jesus made a special effort to reach out to Peter, it became a very powerful moment of forgiveness and of grace. Jesus did something very simple. He asked Peter, "Do you love me?" But he did it 3 times, the same number of times Peter had denied being his follower. The conversation is in John 21, and it went something like this. Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you truly love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said, "you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." Again, Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you truly love me?" He answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." The 3rd time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the 3rd time, "Do you love me?" He said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my sheep." Now, each time Peter responds that he loves him, Jesus gives an instruction. Feed my lambs. Take care of my sheep. Feed my sheep. Now, this isn't like when you go on vacation and ask someone to take care of your pets while you're gone. Jesus is not speaking of actual lambs or sheep. He is speaking of them as his followers. He's telling Peter to take care of his followers, to be a shepherd to the people, much like Jesus has been a shepherd to the people. So basically, he is giving Peter confirmation that he is going to be the foundation on which the church is built. We all mess up. Jesus knows this, and it's actually why he sacrificed himself in the first place. He forgives Peter, and he continues to love him into the person he knows Peter can be. I chose to spend time on this part of the story for one big reason, because I can relate to it. And I suspect that you can too. Peter believed in Jesus. Peter followed Jesus. He knew Jesus had big things in mind for him to do. But When times got tough, Peter blew it. Peter didn't have the courage or the strength to do the right thing when he needed to. He felt embarrassed. He felt ashamed. But Jesus forgave him, and Jesus helped him see his way back to the right path. This is what Jesus can do for each and every one of us. The good news is that Jesus has conquered death once and for all, and that's on a big scale. But it's also on a very personal level for each and every one of us. It's for everyone, yes, and that everyone includes you. Jesus did all of this for you. He is there for you just like he was there for Peter. And it doesn't matter what you have done that you're ashamed of or embarrassed about or wish you had done differently. Jesus is standing before you, giving you a second chance. And Jesus is reminding you that it's not about your past. It's about your present and it's about your future. Lay aside whatever has happened before now. Look ahead with Jesus to what can happen next. And that is the Easter message. I'll see you next time.